Hello, I'm Juliet Foster and welcome to the first edition of Diplomacy in Dialogue, a series of shows in partnership with the German Foreign Office. Well, our topic today is the global coronavirus pandemic and its impact on people, politics and international relations. Well, to help us navigate our way through these complex issues, we have assembled a panel of experts. We're joined by Sebastian Groth, who's Director of Policy Planning at the German Federal Foreign Office, Maria de Mertzis, who's the Deputy Director at the Bruegel think tank, and Dr. Alex Clarkson, Lecturer in German, European and International Studies at King's College London. So thanks to all of you for joining us today. But we're going to begin our interactive Q&A with our panel in just a few moments. But first, let's take a look at today's topic in a little bit more depth. Well, the coronavirus pandemic is the biggest global story of 2020. It's taken lives and affected livelihoods around the world. Well, the numbers themselves tell an extraordinary story. Worldwide, over 19 million people are infected with COVID-19 in 188 countries, with more than 700,000 deaths reported so far. Currently, the United States, Brazil, India and Russia have recorded the highest number of cases. And experts are now predicting the European Union will fall into its deepest economic downturn since the Great Depression, and the signs are already surfacing. The German economy, the largest in Europe, contracted by 10.1% between April and June. Now, in some countries, the pandemic has caused severe political divisions. But in the European Union, we have witnessed unity, with its 27 member states recently endorsing an historic pandemic recovery deal worth a total of 750 billion euros. So is this hard evidence that a multilateral approach is the best way to handle a crisis of this magnitude? And what more can be done by the EU and its leaders to try to work together to prevent further waves of infection? What we do know, what can be said with some certainty, is that the end of this crisis is not in sight. OK, let's bring in our guests. And Sebastian Groth, I'd like to start with you first, because look, 75 billion euros has been pledged, yet the negotiations that led to this agreement, they did reveal some rather deep divisions. Give us a very general idea about what these splits were, and more to the point, have they gone away? And does this mean that Europe itself can now maintain a united front?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, Juliet, for your introduction and the question. Basically, we had two groups of countries negotiating about these 750 billion euro package. There was the so-called Frugal Four that then became the Frugal Five, so a number of countries that took position for a more moderate stance with regard to the volume of the package, but also of the distribution of the package between loans and grants. And there was the other group of the European countries, mainly the most affected countries in the southern part of the Union, that were looking for a bigger volume and also for a bigger portion of grants, because most of these countries already have a very high level of debt, so it would not make sense for them to take new volumes of loans onto their balance sheets. And I think in the course of these 4 days of negotiations, by the end of the day, there was quite a convergence to act fast and also to act substantially. And so there was a consensus on the volume, on the distribution between loans and grants, and now the negotiations with the European Parliament, that is playing a very, very important role, also in the context of the multi-annual financial framework and in the context of the recovery package, are already starting, and we are involved in this also as the European Council presidency that Germany took over on the 1st of July. But we are quite optimistic that we will see some progress after the summer break, so in September and in October.
Right, so you expect the United Front to hold up, but then let's go back to a recent survey for the European Council on Foreign Relations, which I'm sure that you yourself are aware of, but just questioning Italians. They found that 4% of the respondents believed that the EU was a helpful ally during the pandemic, compared to 25% who favoured China. China, they believed, stepped up to the plate. So what does that say about how the public in a key member state actually perceives the bloc?
Yeah, I think that this very poll that you are referring to was made at the beginning of the first phase of the crisis, where I think we have to admit this. The European answer to the crisis was not as European as it could have been. So Italy was looking for equipment and for help, and it took quite a while for the other European partners that were all also taking care of their own populations in this very first phase of the crisis, where a lot of unknowns were still out there. That Italy and the Italians especially felt a little bit alone. And then came in China with a rather limited number of masks and specialists and experts. And China did a very good job in selling their contributions. And I think if you look now to the polls and also to the Italian mood in general, especially after the summit that took place 2 weeks ago, I think that the mood shifted again in Italy, and that there is much more hope and expectation, and also positive feelings towards Brussels and towards this spirit of European solidarity. So I think we as Europeans, we learned our lessons in this early phase of the crisis. And the poll that you are citing also gave us a heads up that we have to do something.
Okay, so Maria de Mertzis, let me bring you here, because look, there were lessons to be learned, and from what Sebastian has said, that is exactly what has been happening. Europe has been taking these issues to heart. But is there a risk that if it somehow loses its way, it could become irrelevant in a post-pandemic environment? There is so much at stake here.
I think it's unlikely. I mean, the decisions that have been made by the European institutions, a number of different European institutions actually, are so binding and so big that it's unlikely to lose momentum. There is now the implementation phase. We're going to implement all these measures that we've decided upon. So there is no momentum to be lost here. The measures will come into place, policies will come into place. And, you know, if there is more policies that need to be taken, we'll need to see about that in the autumn and, of course, in the new phase of the pandemic. I think the EU has done all it could in the past few weeks. It has taken monumental decisions in terms of the size of the policies that they have put forward, certainly by comparison to previous crises. So I think the EU has really done, after the initial phases, and here really certainly I agree with what Sebastian said, now it has taken so many measures that you really can see European cooperation in action.
Right, but was COVID-19 the wake-up call? In other words, had it not been for COVID-19, would we have actually seen this momentousness, this determination to fulfill its purpose?
I think that's unlikely. You see, a change only happens through dramatic events, and the EU is no different in this respect. You know, big institutional, architectural changes, as we have seen in the past, happen when there is absolute need for them to happen. They do not happen unless there really is an absolute need for them. We saw that back in 2012 with banking union, a monumental architectural change. We see it now with the increase of the EU budget, albeit once, but still a monumental increase of the EU budget in terms of putting money forward for fighting the pandemic. You know, I think we wouldn't have seen such an increase in the budget unless there was an incredible need for it. But the important thing here is when there was a need for it, the EU did manage to step up.
Right. And Dr. Alex Clarkson, I'd like to bring you in here at this point of the conversation, because look, the vibes I'm getting is that the EU is very committed to the principle of working together. Does that therefore mean that the every man for himself mentality has run out of rope? Because there were some countries which were quite guilty of that even before the pandemic.
I think that depends on which policy field you look at. And that's one of the interesting aspects of European integration, that in every policy field you have a level of integrated response at different levels. I mean, as has been pointed out in terms of the Eurozone and the vulnerabilities from past crises, I think the European Union responded very quickly in developing this financial and economic aid package, largely because these vulnerabilities are already known. Where I have greater concerns is in the extent to which the EU can respond to crises surrounding it. The EU finds itself in several neighborhoods in North Africa, in the Levant, in the Middle East, in the East and Eastern Europe, where you have a number of different states under extreme pressure from COVID and a number of other crises. Lebanon is a case in point, where the EU is going to have to react very rapidly if it wants to secure its borders, secure stability around its borders, and ensure that a rise in coronavirus cases in these countries doesn't suddenly fall back onto the EU itself. And this is an area in terms of projecting EU geopolitical power outwards, where EU institutions are still not very coordinated and often react in a very weak and uncoordinated fashion.
Right, so given those factors, again, underpinned by COVID-19, what strategy should the EU try to embrace in the wake of a second wave of that pandemic? And what happens if that strategy fails? Because again, this is a high-risk game. There is so much at stake.
I think at this point, I mean, if we look at places like Libya or Lebanon or policy towards Ukraine and Russia, the EU needs to develop the level of coordinated response and integration that it has, say, in terms of Eurozone policy and increasingly in policies such as involving public health, which is essential to managing coronavirus within the bloc. If the EU does not develop the same kind of integrated systems and level of coordination where somebody at the center can bang heads together if, say, Rome and Paris disagree about how to handle events in Libya, then it's not just geopolitical stability or military security stability that becomes a problem. It becomes a problem when instability in these countries means that they cannot handle the virus, they cannot handle the COVID-19 crisis, just look at Lebanon right now, and where that develops migration waves, insecurity, destabilization, that in the end means that the EU will have to handle these crises down the line. The faster it can respond, the more it develops a shared rapid response mechanism to deal with crises along its borders and crises in states that neighbor it. Lebanon, for example, is a neighboring state of the EU through its sea border with Cyprus. And the faster it can react, the faster it can staunch problems and ensure that the virus is handled in these states, as well as all the other problems that they face.
Has COVID-19 put the EU in the last chance saloon? Alex?
No, I don't think so. I think what it does is, as with every state system it's confronted, China, the United States, Canada, every state it's confronted, it has pointed to the vulnerabilities in these states. And actually, in terms of the EU's rapid response over issues such as Eurozone consolidation, economic aid, it's shown how much the EU has learned from previous crises. But I suspect in the coming months and years, it's also going to hit where the EU is weakest, namely its ability to project geopolitical power outwards, its ability to stabilize neighboring states, its ability to, say, get countries like Italy and France on the same page when it comes to dealing with a crisis in places like Libya. And this all impacts in terms of public health. If a country like Libya or Egypt or Lebanon has a high level of coronavirus cases and is destabilized and collapses, then that very quickly makes it difficult to contain both the virus and other forms of insecurity in these states, which will very swiftly come across its borders and affect EU states on the front line in the Mediterranean or Eastern Europe.
Okay, Sebastian Groth, can I come to you? Because in a weird, strange sort of way, you could argue that COVID-19 has become a platform for advocating the importance of countries working together. Now, if that's the case, is multilateralism strong enough to undermine the nation-state narrative that has dominated the political landscape?
Well, I don't think that this is really a contradiction, a nation state and multilateralism. You need nation states to construct and build up a functioning multilateralism that is based on a sort of cooperative sovereignty of states. And that's what the EU all is about. It's a concept of pooled sovereignty, but the nation state still has a role to play. So this is the multi-level governance idea. What I would like to stress, though, is that we have to think more innovatively about new forms of multilateralism. And there, I think what the EU set up in the early days of May with a digital online conference, pledging conference for the vaccine accelerator, and I think 7.5 billion euros came together, is such a new form of multilateralism, involving states, involving multilateral institutions, involving private foundations, philanthropists, companies, industry. And I think in the face of this crisis, this is exactly what we need. I'm not too pessimistic that this crisis is a trigger for this new form of multilateralism, and the EU has a very, very strong role to play in this regard.
Let's take that idea a little bit further. I want to bring in Maria here because we had the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who said that the 7-year budget deal and recovery fund was, in her words, next generation Europe. So do you share that sense of optimism in that statement that the EU will emerge in a much stronger position from this crisis?
If you'd asked me maybe 6 months ago if there was ever going to be more centralization of fiscal powers in the EU, I would have been very pessimistic. I would have thought that the EU is capable of centralizing more money to basically deal with common problems. Here we are now in August 2020, and we have almost doubled, not quite, but almost doubled the EU budget. This is unprecedented, and most of it will come in the form of grants and money that will be directed to certain purposes. And this is money that effectively will pull together to help countries for certain needs. This is unprecedented. It's really quite incredible by comparison to where we thought we were heading about 6 months ago. So yeah, I am actually very optimistic about the direction that the EU travels. I think this is very good news in terms of providing the solidarity that I believe European citizens are asking for. In the elections last May, about a year ago now, the European elections, I mean, you really saw the unprecedented participation of the citizens in European elections. This was the first time that the European citizen says, look, the types of problems that we're facing, and this is before the pandemic, require European solutions, if not global solutions. And I think that the EU has managed to come together in actually a relatively short time and deal with an unprecedented problem with very effective means.
Which begs the question, Dr. Clarkson, that with this unprecedented fiscal behaviour that we've seen, what will EU diplomacy itself look like in the post-pandemic world? And from the perspective of the public, will it be in any way different to what they're used to?
And I think this is again where we come back to the extent to which EU integration depends which policy field you're looking at. To back up what Maria was saying, domestically, internally, we're seeing a real good, strong push towards centralization, which is essential. If every part of the EU system is dependent on the other, then the EU, Germany or France or Italy need to make sure that the public health systems of Lithuania or Latvia or Romania or Portugal are all pretty much at the same level, are all able to cope with the crisis in the same way if this level of integration is to be kept and something more state-like is to emerge through EU integration. The problem is that while this level of centralization is to be observed internally and has really made tremendous leaps forward, the EU cannot isolate itself from the world outside. And the problem is that when it comes to diplomacy outward, when it comes to dealing with states like Libya or Lebanon or Egypt, where if their public health systems cannot handle the pressures of coronavirus, we will see instability. We will see knock-on effects on a whole set of other issues, and it will affect the EU. There we often see the EU and its External Action Service in a weak position because the various member states pursue rival agendas, and it's very, very difficult for the Commission, for central EU leaders, for member states like Germany that want to bring everybody together on the table, to bang heads together and to make sure that, say, Paris and Rome and Madrid are all following the same line. And this is, I think, where we have variable levels of integration. Strong integration at the center, strong integration internally, but weaknesses in terms of dealing with the world outside that I think could come back and cause further crises for the EU in the 2020s.
OK then, well, let's break off for a few moments to get the thoughts of the public. This is what they had to say when we asked if they thought that governments had done enough in the face of the pandemic.
We are from Germany, and we see that, like here or in France, for example, it's a bit different. So in Germany, it's more strict, the rules, and in other countries it's more wear a mask, but it's not important to keep distance or something like this.
All the government of Europe must work together to fight against this virus. Europe is very important in this case.
We understood that it was bad in Italy, we understood that it was bad in Spain, but no, I wasn't aware of any coordinated effort.
I think they do what they can with the information they get day after day. So I think the reaction of each government is quite good till now, but we'll see what will happen in the next few weeks.
I work in the film industry and it's been hit really hard by it, as in nothing happening right now, so I'm just so eager for that to, start up, and I don't know. No one can give me answers to when, so it's a bit scary right now.
During this whole corona situation, I felt like the government didn't really give us guidelines. It took a long time before we actually knew if we even had to do exams or if we were even able to graduate. So that's my biggest advice for them, just to be more clear.
I don't think it had a joint multilateral response. I am very much in favor of the European Union, and I was very disappointed that each country acted as a kind of knee-jerk reaction, and countries were not communicated, not helping each other.
Well, the thoughts there of the public. Let's just have a reminder or roundup of some of the main points that emerged there. We heard that countries didn't help each other. There were no answers or indeed guidelines. In other words, communication was poor and there was no sense of a coordinated approach. Although having said that, one of our Vox poppers was very favourable about the EU, but there was that remark, see how they get on in the next few weeks. And Maria de Mertzes, I'd love to get your reaction to that Vox pop, and more specifically, what it thinks EU tells us, or tells the EU about the way that it's regarded by the general public, because it does seem that there's still quite a bit of work to go in making that relationship more connected.
Yes, I mean, I certainly share some of the sentiments that we've heard from the public. There is no doubt, and I think Sebastian also raised this point, that the initial reaction was a very defensive reaction, and it was as though everybody for themselves. There was also, a refusal of export of vital things that countries needed. This was really not on, and it was not certainly in line with the principles of the EU. So certainly there were mistakes made, and the issue of communication, of course, it's vital and failed us in a number of respects. I like to believe that human nature is very defensive, and some of it is justified. But after that, very quickly, the EU realized that this isn't the way to deal with the problem. There is a need for coordinated action. Now, one point I will say is that the speed at which the disease caught up with the countries was actually quite different. It started with Italy. Italy had a very steep learning curve in terms of how to deal with the disease. So some of the differentiation in the way that countries reacted is actually justified by the disease themselves. But I think the communication aspect is a very important one, and this is the bit that I think the biggest learning has been had. From now on, I think countries have learned a lot about how to deal with the disease, and there is communication between countries. More needs to be done in terms of travel advice, in terms of what happens to the things that affect everybody's life. Things from when do the schools open? We heard one of our speakers say things about, can we take exams? These are crucial. They're very important. They will depend very much on what happens in September, when we will see, dare I say, the second phase of the disease.
That's right, because I guess the worry as well is whether COVID-19, particularly in that second wave, whether it has the potential to create or indeed widen a gulf that exists between the public and the EU itself. Are you fearful of that?
Actually, I'm not. I think that much we have learned. I think now, first of all, we have more experience with the disease. We've had, we learned the hard way, as it were. And this time around, there's going to be a lot more exchange of information between countries, between communities within countries. I think that's also very important. I am actually hopeful that the second time round, having gone through the first phase, things will go smoother. And I certainly hope that the issue of communication will be handled much better this time around.
And Dr. Alex Clarkson, if they don't get the communication message right, is there a risk of estrangement between the public and the EU? And is that effectively a rejection of multilateralism?
I think one of the most fascinating paradoxes, particularly about recent polling in Italy, is that while you have frustration with the EU, it's not necessarily frustration that expresses itself in rejection of European integration. It expresses itself in demands for further EU action. And I think that's a very, very interesting shift. Maybe a few years ago, even in the populist wave during the Eurozone crisis, you had a lot of serious discussion that if the EU didn't perform, departure or Eurosceptic messages of departure might be most necessary. Now in countries like Italy or Greece or Spain, you have demands that the EU do more. And in that sense, you have people responding to the EU much more in the way they respond to national governments. If we take an example, if the citizens of Suceava region in Romania are frustrated with the central Romanian government, they make more demands of the Romanian government. They don't asking to leave Romania, they just want the Romanian government to do more. And we're seeing something quite similar on the EU level. Citizens aren't saying, if you don't do anything for us, we want to leave. They're saying, you need to do more for us because we see ourselves as part of your system and your system needs to serve us. So in the sense, it is frustration and skepticism, partly because the EU is not very good at communicating the basic things it does to enable crisis response. Here the ECDC, the European Centre for Disease Control, could play a more central role. But in terms of public responses, it's not led to the kind of Euroscepticism of we want to leave. It's led to the kind of political engagement of you are here to serve us, we want more, we want you to do more and integrate more. And that's actually a very, very interesting shift in terms of discourse and attitudes to European integration.
Because there were some academics who felt that, again, because of these communication issues and the irritation that some members of the public felt towards the EU, that perhaps it put the surviving liberal democracies on life support. And if you like, COVID-19 perhaps made it inevitable that it would be gasping for its last breath. But I mean, is there any fairness in that? Is it possible that if the EU doesn't get it right, then the liberal democracies could find themselves standing on even dodgier ground?
I think a lot of the responses to the EU's struggles around coronavirus had an air of people refighting the last war. So many of the people analysing the EU from my generation in particular have been shaped by its recent crises, from the financial crisis and Eurozone crisis onwards. So they were looking backwards. And in that sense, I think a lot of what's happened in terms of EU responses and public responses haven't necessarily matched previous experiences. This is a new environment, it's a new kind of crisis, a new kind of system. But it also, in my opinion, means to a great extent that the core problems of the EU responses, the core sources of crisis in the 2020s are being missed. And I think these are primarily to do with the EU's weaknesses and inability to coordinate power projection outwards in dealing with all of these neighboring states and the crises that they're facing, partly because of coronavirus. That's the next war, so to speak. That's the next campaign. In many ways, it will be a very real war because it will involve the use of military power. And I think that's the next crisis facing the EU that is sort of being missed to an extent because people are refighting the crises and refighting the arguments of its past crisis rather than facing up to what's going to hit it in the future.
I'd like to get your response to that, Sebastian Groth. What's your take on that, to what you've just heard?
Well, I'd like to come back to the question that you brought up with regard to liberal democracies. I would not be as pessimistic. I mean, this COVID crisis is a challenge to each and every society and state and political system, and we analyzed it quite from the very beginning also as a systemic competition in how far different forms of governance, different forms of democracy, or also not so democratic states are really in a position to manage this crisis and to also steer the discussion with transparency, also with a fact-based, scientifically based arguments and in a transparent and inclusive manner. And I think if you look not only to Europe, but also to countries like South Korea and also to Taiwan, you see a number of democratic states and democratic systems that are doing quite well. So I'm not too pessimistic. And the second point I'd like to make also with regard to the European Union is if you look to the overall reaction to this crisis globally since January, February of this year, there's only one really multilateral, combined, substantial political approach, and this is the European one. You haven't seen this from other areas of the world, and you haven't seen this so far from other levels of global cooperation. So I would say for the time being, we are on the right path here.
Okay, the right side of history. And Maria de Merces, I mean, look, this idea of a generation gap has been mentioned in the course of this discussion, but would you say that one of the things we've learnt from this crisis is that perhaps young people are more in favour or more supportive of multilateralism, whereas older people may be a bit more sceptical, having survived the banking crisis, and perhaps they're generally disillusioned with the direction in which Europe is going, that perhaps that's made them more pessimistic, whereas with younger people, they see sunshine coming in through the window. Is that your perception?
I think the differences between generations are actually rather complicated. There is a lot to discuss here in terms of perceptions. If you think about indebtedness, which is one of the biggest problems actually that the global economy is faced with, and no doubt will face even harder in the months to come, that has got direct implications about the ability of each generation to deal with its own future. So I think there are different issues here. One important, I think, realization is that the public in general, but mostly the young, have realized that whatever the challenges that we have moving forward, we require global solutions. At the very least, we require coordinated solutions in the immediate vicinity, but better, we require global solutions. I mean, if you think about climate change, which is perhaps the number one problem with which the young generation really is occupied with, they demand global solutions, and they certainly demand solutions at the European level, at a coordinated level. So I think that is an important realization, that you can only achieve good and sustainable solutions if you actually talk to each other. Multilateralism is a way of doing that, and Europe is very much, had always been in fact, and remains a big advocate of multilateralism. And I'm really delighted to see that it is the young that are pushing this more than anybody else. But quite frankly, I don't believe that the old do not like multilateralism. I think there are differences, but I think in general, on average, the European public believes in coordinated solutions, with the young, who, by the way, will bear most of the burden, the big advocates of it.
Yeah, I'd like to bring in Dr. Clarkson, because, again, looking ahead to build this new strategy going forward in this post-pandemic world, is it inevitable that the European countries that perhaps survived relatively unscathed the COVID-19 pandemic, they are the ones who are better suited to build and navigate that strategy? In other words, well, Germany, certainly, because it's the biggest economy, so it has the heft, but also France, its regular partner. Is it inevitable that responsibility will fall to them?
Also would include Italy. I think the performance of the Italian state I wasn't surprised by it, but the performance of the Italian state has been impressive, and they have a lot to contribute to this. I think in a wider problem that the EU faces is that the EU states have become accustomed to working together with the US, or expecting US leadership. And either temporarily over the next 18 months to 2 years, or perhaps more long term, the EU might face a situation where the United States is neither willing nor capable or able to lead. And I think this is the interesting question for the EU. Will the EU be able to step up in a situation where the United States is no longer a functioning partner? I don't necessarily believe permanently, but possibly for stretches of time as it sorts its own internal difficulties out. And that's actually maybe the next big question for EU integration. Can the EU be the central actor? Can the EU be a central player that can coordinate global responses if it can no longer rely on the United States? And if we were talking beforehand about the survival of liberal democracy, if there was ever evidence that liberal democracy needed another pole, another power, a European pole and maybe a Japanese or East Asian pole to keep it going, if the United States is no longer capable of functioning, this is a crisis that pretty much shows that the EU does need to step up and does need to lead. And let's see, we'll have to see whether it's capable of doing so.
Let me bring in Sebastian Groth. Do you think the EU is capable of that responsibility further on down the line? And particularly big countries like Germany, there may well be political and financial compromises. Are they willing to do that when they have to balance it up against domestic concerns?
Well, I think we are on a good learning curve here. The European Union, as a union, is still one of the most important payers in the multilateral system. So now it's up to us to become also a central player in the system. And I think if you look, for example, to the WHO and the World Health Assembly that took place in May, you've seen already a little bit of this conceptual and political leadership of the European Union, because it was a proposal of the European Union that was then adopted by unanimity by the World Health Assembly in a very, very complicated situation where we had a strong antagonism between the big players like China and the US on some central questions on the role of the WHO. And I think what we see right now is that the EU is becoming aware of what Alexander was talking about, also a US leadership that is not as strong as it was in the years before. And in order to fill this gap or this void politically, financially, conceptually, it is up also to the Europeans. Otherwise, other countries, other actors might fill this gap that follow not our values and our norms and our normative approaches. So I think there's also some sort of operational pressure now that the Europeans get their act together. Whereas Germany is concerned, I think the positioning of the German public vis-à-vis the European Union is still quite very pro-integrationist and pro-European. And what we've seen in the discussions in the context of the European Council and with the French-German proposal about this 750 billion euro package is a real paradigm shift also for the German discussion especially. I would say that we are now also with this role as a presidency of the European Union very much trying to be a moderator of European interests within the European Union, but also a motor of European interests in trying to move things forward, and both in a spirit of solidarity in the domestic sphere, so the Europeans have to help mutually themselves, but also in the spirit of sovereignty in the outer sphere. So that means strengthening the European capacity to act and being a more active global actor on the global stage.
Okay, then let's break away from our panel for a few moments, because what I want to do now is to, well, introduce you to the public's response to the second of our big questions. And we asked if they thought governments were prepared for a potential second wave of COVID-19.
I think if there was a second wave, the EU would definitely be better prepared in understanding the coordination that's needed for movement of people, so coordinated lockdown, attempts when hotspots flare up. I don't know how prepared they will be in terms of equitable distribution of treatments and further tests.
Yes, I believe that the governments are fully prepared, because we've gone through the first wave and we've seen the good job that they've done. If there's a second wave, the government are prepared, the citizens are fully prepared as well. That I believe.
I think letting people go abroad, like to Italy or Spain, is a really stupid decision. I honestly think that we should have just stayed at home and urged people to just stay at home, actually.
I don't know. I really don't know. I think they try to plan as they can, but it's quite difficult, and it's also depending on what the people, what all citizens will do in the next few days, next few weeks. If the people become a little bit more aware of the real situation.
If there is a second wave, I think they are better prepared, and I definitely hope so. I mean, obviously everybody was caught by surprise in the first one. So yeah, I think they would be better prepared for the future. Yeah.
If there is a second wave, I would hope that they would work together. I hear that countries are beginning to talk about their own boundaries again. I hear that my country origin is already thinking of a kind of banning people or imposing a lockdown of some sort. I am not sure whether there is enough of communication, but I do sincerely hope that some lessons will be drawn from the first incident, and it would be all the countries will be working together?
I think now they are better prepared because it happened once and now we know better what we have to do when something like this happens.
Well, the views there of the public, communication came up, but overall, it does appear as if people are hopeful about Europe's ability to handle a second wave of COVID-19. The question, of course, do our panel share that optimism? Dr. Alex Clarkson, let me start with you, because look, where we are now, there have been outbreaks in other parts of Europe, in regions, etc., certainly over here in the United Kingdom. But then it has spawned this talk about the hunt for a vaccine, the deadline to be met quickly. Could the hunt for a vaccine undermine that hopefulness? Bearing in mind that one of the Vox poppers, touching on a key point, actually said, well, referenced the equitable distribution of a treatment. Finding a vaccine to COVID-19 is the big holy grail. And whoever comes up with that treatment will have extraordinary geopolitical power.
And a lot of this comes down to expectation management, as we've seen in the UK. So if you look at the issue in terms of finding a vaccine, I mean, what we see is several different projects running in parallel. And even though it might be temporarily a geopolitical tool for whoever gets there first, there are multiple approaches and projects that indicate there would be several vaccines in play that would balance that. I think an issue of concern is expectation management once a vaccine is achieved. Because there's a difference between having a workable vaccine and then rolling it out industrially and preparing public health systems to distribute it to wider populations. So one of the key tasks facing European governments in the EU is to basically communicate to people that when a vaccine is reached, that doesn't necessarily mean that public attention and effort needs to slacken. There's going to be several months until the vaccine is rolled out across Europe and across globally, where a lot of measures will still have to stay in place. And that will be a huge challenge, because once a vaccine is arrived at, many people will want normalization possibly quicker than it's possible. So that's a huge challenge in terms of communications, a huge challenge in terms of expectations management, and also a huge challenge in terms of projecting power outwards to help all those countries around the EU that don't have the EU's public health systems and resources to roll out a vaccine in a way as quickly as possible that the EU needs as much as they need.
Can I pick up on that point about expectations and really throw it to the other panelists to find out whether you share that? I mean, Maria de Merz says, has the EU managed public expectations about a vaccine successfully, or do you feel that it somehow got caught up in the hype of all this? It's all about finding a cure and somehow being first in the race without looking at the much bigger implications, as have been pointed out by Dr. Alex Clarkson.
I mean, I certainly believe that one of the, impressive things, and I say that rather reluctantly, is the fact that, all countries, and I follow news actually in different countries because of the nature of my personal life, have been very quick and very clear in relying on science. All the decisions that have been made, some of them with political flavors, but have really been based on facts and on what science is telling us. And science doesn't have all the answers, because science is also learning. So I think in terms of that, I think I'm very encouraged. And it shouldn't be any other way. But in this day and age of fake news, it's very important to emphasize how clear science is as the only solution to these types of problems. And I think that all countries in the EU, at least the ones that I follow, have been very successful in terms of telling the public what they know based on scientific facts. So I think in terms of management of expectations, we all know that we need to listen to the scientists. And as they learn, we learn. And a very big thing that will only determine the success of our fight against the pandemic is how quickly the public is educated. And this is now the big next problem, is have we educated the public in terms of dealing with the pandemic. The shutdowns, we all closed ourselves inside our homes. In the second wave, in the second phase of the pandemic, the young are out, and the young are now the ones that are transmitting the disease in most countries that I follow. We need a new type of communication that is directed to the young to try and alleviate exactly that particular problem. So all of this is being done based on hard facts and with very, very good and clear intentions. As I said, there is so many uncertainties here that you can't say that we have all the answers. But if we follow the principle of listening to the scientists, communicating clearly and simply. I think that is the best way of managing expectations, and at the same time educating the public as new information comes in.
And Sebastian Groth, is that your take on this? Do you feel that the EU has actually been successful in managing expectations about this vaccine, more particularly how quickly we can have it? Because you know what, we're hearing some governments outside the bloc talking about having a vaccine before the year's out, and their own medical advisors saying, well, hang on a minute, you've got to be a bit more realistic. What are we hearing from the EU that somehow stands as a counterweight against the other narrative?
Well, I think for the time being, it's really too early to tell. We know that there are about 150, 160 trials going on. A lot of them, or at least some of them, already in phase 3. But what we all also know is that phase 3 is called the death valley of vaccines. So that's where most of the candidates don't survive. Not the candidates in terms of people who use it, but of course the vaccines. So that means we are not there yet. And I fully share what Alexander and Maria said with regard to expectation management. We have so many unknowns about the production, and then about the distribution, and then the application. We don't even know if we would need one day 1 shot, 2 shots, or 3 shots, or how long the immune system will be activated by a vaccine. So insofar, I think we have to prepare our publics and our societies that it's more or less the non-pharmaceutical interventions that will lead the way for the next months at least. So we are looking more broadly into mid-2021 as far as I read the briefings and the scientific estimations about the success or the progress in research. I also would like to stress what Maria said about this scientific approach that we are following, both in Europe but also on the national level. I think this is very good. This is very adequate, and we are all together in this learning curve. And by the end of the day, many of the decisions that we have to take are political decisions, but the decision-making process by itself is fed by scientists. And not only, I'm not talking only about virologists, but it's also a question of psychology, of sociology, of course, a lot of economy also. And it's up to the political level to then bring together all these different positions and make wise and good political decisions. And what I would say so far is that we are doing quite well. We now have a very different or difficult situation with regard of the school opening. We have very, very intense discussions here in Germany about this, and I know that it's similar in other parts of the European Union. And we will see, even there we are still learning. We have to look for concepts of social distancing for pupils, which is very difficult according to their age. We have to separate the classes. We probably have to work on the curricula and do some things or leave some things out that we used to do, like singing in music classes and these sort of things. But this is something that we have to adapt now, I think, as a society, at least for a transition phase.
Right, but Maria, bringing it back to a point that you made a few moments ago, really the power of communication, being consistent with the messaging, etc. It does look as if we may be heading towards this second wave of a pandemic. If the messaging falls short in some way, shape or form, isn't there the risk of the EU losing perhaps respect amongst members of the population in Europe? And dare I say it, perhaps some member states feeling, well, maybe it's time to part company with the EU, or if we stay within the EU, redefine the relationship on terms that we feel we can live and work with.
Well, let me start with the second part of your question. I really don't believe that this is jeopardizing the EU in any way. I think it's clear for the public that we need coordinated actions, and the EU has already delivered on many levels. So I just don't see any realistic threat in that respect. But in terms of, the risk that politicians run, and naturally, the quality of outcomes will determine how successful politicians have been. And, as Sebastian said, I think the politicians are there to take the tough decisions. They are faced with dilemmas. Close downs are, of course, the way to deal with the pandemic, but, you suffocate the economy at the same time. How do you manage that? And this is not an easy dilemma to resolve. What's important is to have clear information from all the experts, and again, as Sebastian said, all the experts around the issue that are relevant for providing information. The politicians have a very careful and very sensitive balancing act to manage, and making sure that we save lives, that we protect the public from being infected, but at the same time ensuring that people can live, they have the means to live. The households have been suffering as a result of the close down. All of this is a dilemma, and politicians will have to resolve this dilemma, and indeed the quality of these decisions will determine how they're perceived in the public. That is the job of politicians, and this is no different.
And Dr. Clarkson, is it fair to say that perhaps the risks of walking away from the bloc are a deterrent in themselves? In other words, COVID-19 has killed off whatever aspirations some countries may once have harboured of leaving the bloc. And is it possible as well that they're looking at what happens to the United Kingdom at the end of this year, because that is when Britain officially leaves the European Union, the EU?
I think it's always, one should always say, never say never. I think it's an issue of risks and probabilities, but certainly the probabilities have gone down significantly. And if we're going to learn lessons from this, one of the biggest policy lessons that's to be learned, and there's actually lessons shared across the EU, another reason why EU institutions have played such an important role, is the extent to which any kind of crisis of this nature doesn't just involve one policy area. It's not just a public health crisis that involves health services. The resilience of EU states and EU societies has been that many, particularly Italy, very quickly identified the fact that this is a civil defense crisis. The term civil defense kind of fell out of fashion after the Cold War, but it's a civil defense crisis where you have to have all state actors working together, from education to health to military to gendarmerie, carabinieri, to civil defense agencies, civil protection agencies, as well as hospitals, care homes, and so on. And I think there's also a kind of discussion we could have about European or sort of a set of crisis responses that also we find in places like democracies like South Korea, that maybe the UK could learn from in terms of the need for substantial state capacity. And this is a lesson for the EU. But in a sense, austerity is a threat to national security. The states that coped best were the states that, despite the pressures of the Eurozone crisis, were states like Italy that had substantial state capacity in key areas, that had the carabinieri, the police on the ground, the health services like Germany, the testing capacity. And that it's essentially, if the EU is to survive, if liberal democracy is just to survive, they're going to have to invest and expand in state capacity to be able to deal with whatever future crisis they face in as an all-round issue. Maybe this is also a lesson for diplomats and diplomatic services about the extent to which they need crisis response teams, that the investment that's already been there needs to be beefed up to help crisis response teams, interagency cooperation, a kind of national security framework that treats security and civil defense in a rounded sense, and not just focused on specific policy fields with every crisis. That's maybe a lesson the EU could learn as well.
Okay, let's break away from this for the moment, from the Q&A session, because what I want to do now is to introduce the Twitters. A number of people have responded to our call for them to get involved. Again, this is not directed at anyone in particular, but please do feel free to take it on. The Twitter says, what does diplomacy have to do with it? Seems that countries first and foremost follow their own national interests in fighting COVID-19, which appears to contradict the optimism that we had at the beginning of our discussion, that the every man for himself mentality has been thrown overboard. But this particular messenger disagrees. Who's going to respond to that?
Well, probably I start. Oh, no, go ahead,
sure,
Maria.
Okay, Maria and then Sebastian.
Okay. I'd just like to use some of Sebastian's words actually to say that, the multilateralism, which is actually, another word for cooperation, is not necessarily contradicting the need for a nation state. And, the mistakes apart that were done at the beginning, which I think we've all acknowledged that, they don't contradict. The country can protect itself by engaging in multilateral dialogue. And I think it's crucial that we understand that. We will never fight the pandemic, and we will never fight climate change, issues like climate change, if we don't understand that cooperation at the EU level and at the global level is pivotal. So I just don't see the two as antagonistic.
Okay, and Sebastian.
Yeah, from the very practical side, probably what diplomacy is there for. I mean, in April, for example, we had a G20 meeting of I think finance ministers, and part of this meeting also was prepared by civil servants, by diplomats, and one of the outcomes of this meeting was a moratorium of debt for the global South. That's a very concrete result. Some may say it's not enough, but I would say it's a beginning, and it was an important decision with regard to reaching out to the global South. The second example is the question: how do we reform the global health system? How do we reform global institutions like the WHO in order to be better prepared for the next pandemic or the next event that might affect us? And in this regard, you have difficult negotiations, because you're talking about a lot of money, you're talking about political decisions, you're also talking about models of governance, how you steer processes, how inclusive, how transparent are these processes. And if we don't act there decisively, also as countries coming from the so-called liberal democracies, I think we will lose ground in this process. So this is also something now where we have to fight for our values, for our norms, and where we stand for as the family of nations that is still being part of the West, not geographically, but more ideally. And I think this is extremely important, and COVID made this even more clearer and brought this more to the forefront, how important it is.
Okay, let me come in now with another Twitter comment, which I would like Dr. Alex Clarkson to address first, and then if my other guests wish to respond, please do feel free. This reads: how can the EU transfer its successful approach towards the pandemic into real power gains vis-à-vis the United States and China? Dr. Clarkson.
If we look in terms of the EU simply defending its own space and it's defending its own system, I think that despite the pretty bad impression left in that early phase in March, the EU's recovered a lot, the EU's managed to build up. China's initial advantage in terms of coming out and selling its model of crisis response has diminished very rapidly, as a lot of criticism and frustration with Chinese policy responses have emerged. The same with the US. I think it's also, this leads up to a very, very difficult question for the EU. As the EU operates increasingly, obviously it's still a multilateral institution in some ways, but it's increasingly state-like in others. The question is, how far does it want to get into even a competitive dynamic with the US and China? How far does it even want to leave that impression? And I think it's a very, very difficult challenge for the EU. I think the EU should, as far as possible, avoid such a competitive dynamic to present itself as a force for cooperation. The moment it gets into geopolitical power games, it ends up into games that it will likely only damage all sides. So as far as possible, maybe the EU wants to pull out of that kind of discourse and framework and present itself as something different and something less interested in a form of celebrating great power competition, and more maybe an actor that can bring other great powers together.
Okay, and would our other guests like to respond to that before I move on to our final tweet?
Yeah, if I may, I don't believe the EU has got the ambition of being a global hegemon. I think the EU, the way that it sees itself, is much more a union of projecting soft power rather than hard power. You know, all the positions that the EU has taken in the global scene have been positions of multilateralism, of global cooperation. And to the extent that the EU can exert leadership in certain things, it will be on very specific things. And again, a demonstration of soft power. For example, the GDPR or the fight against global climate change. So I actually don't think that there is an ambition to become a hegemon. However, and here I really have some sympathy for some of the things that Alex has said, for the EU to protect itself and to protect its interests and its way of life, it does need to get important positions and get into the game, understand what it thinks about China, understands what it feels about a non-cooperative US. So this global shifting of leadership position do affect the position that the EU needs to take. But all of that in the context of protecting its own interests rather than of being a global hegemon.
Okay, let's go on to our final Twitter, and I'd like all of you to respond. How can diplomacy work effectively without its main driver? In other words, the direct contact and exchange. How can diplomacy work effectively without its main driver, the direct contact and exchange? Sebastian.
Well, indeed, this is a challenge. This is a challenge for all of us. Fortunately enough, at least our minister started to travel again, so he has the possibility to meet his counterparts, and we already had one Foreign Affairs Council also meeting physically in Brussels, and of course we had also the European Council meeting physically, and there you see how important it is to see eye to eye the other participants of these very complex and difficult negotiations. But what the question is alluding to is indeed a challenging situation. For example, if we talk about political negotiations with regard to crisis, to political crisis, to military crisis. So how do we achieve, for example, to bring together the different actors of the Libyan civil war and conflict in a situation where we are not in a position to gather 200 or 300 or 400 people in a room, which sometimes is necessary in order to build up a spirit of negotiation and trust. On the other hand, I think already the diplomacy and international politics learned a lot. So the push that we had as the Foreign Ministry also in Berlin with regard to the use of digital tools for our work has never been as strongly felt as through COVID. So we invested a lot in our digital equipment, and we made really quantum leaps also in the use of it, because owning it is one thing, but then using it and also benefiting from it is another. And what we have now much more frequently than before, for example, is video conferences with parts of our network all over the world, also with think tanks and diplomatic partners. So we as policy planning, now we have regular video meetings with our counterparts. Otherwise, you would have traveled probably to the Netherlands, to UK, to France. Now you do it online and it's functioning. But by the end of the day, the personal contact, the personal relationship is an asset and is extremely important, especially in this field of diplomacy.
Okay, and can I have a response, please, from Dr. Alex Clarkson to that final tweet?
I think however much there's been a kind of a digital revolution in diplomacy, I think there's a lesson to be learned here about the value of having, particularly in terms of states bordering the EU, the lesson of having, the value of having diplomats, people from intelligence services or military personnel on the ground. And I think after 20, 30 years of ongoing budget cuts that many EU states have done in terms of investing in diplomatic personnel, I think there's now strong argument in terms of beefing up the size of embassies, developing more active interagency processes so that military personnel can be deployed or placed, or intelligence services personnel can be placed, or public health and civil defense personnel like THV can be placed in all of these countries, because the assumption that you can always travel in or deal with something electronically in this kind of crisis has been thrown up into question. It's sometimes more valuable to make a risk assessment and say, actually, we need 20, 30, 40 people in this embassy, in this key state neighboring the EU, that know what's going on, and that if we can't travel, can go out and still represent our interests. Just look at the size of the Italian delegation or the Italian presence in Tripoli and the ability of the Italians to reach through and figure out what's going on there. That, I think, is a very strong lesson that needs to be taken on board by other European diplomatic services, that maybe it's time to invest more and put more people and build more embassies and build more positions where you have people on the ground that can represent your interests more actively without having to worry about a Wi-Fi connection or whether you can fly in or out.
Okay, and finally, Maria de Mertzis.
I don't believe that any relationship, however impersonal or however professional, does not need the physical, the personal relationship. I think there's a lot to be said. I mean, the very expression eye to eye comes from the fact that we have to look each other eye to eye to be able to really understand what is going on. So, you know, there is a loss here as a result of having to do everything digitally, and we have to reckon with that. On the other hand, there's also a gain. I mean, just the digital transformation that we've all had to quickly be educated in actually is saving the environment. So, you know, it's just making us look at things that are in a slightly different way, and I think it's important to actually understand that as well. However, I do believe that diplomatic relations will have to fall back on personal relations and on the ability to see and understand and feel the issues as they come in personal discussions. So I think for the moment we have to perhaps reckon with that loss in order to make sure that we fight the pandemic. But once that stops to exist, ceases to exist, we need to slowly come back to something new, a new normal, not the old normal, some new normal in which then the physical relation can also play an important role.
Okay, a sound note on which to end, but that's it from all of us. I'd like to thank my guests, Sebastian Groth, Maria de Mercis and Dr. Alex Clarkson for their time, and thanks too to you for watching. We'll see you again soon in the next Diplomacy in Dialogue. For now, goodbye.